This is a disclaimer. This episode may contain graphic descriptions of crime and criminal activity. It therefore may not be suitable for listeners under the age of 18 or for those who may find the descriptions as disturbing. Listeners' discretion is advised. Hello and welcome to another episode of Krime KE podcast. My good name is still Jomo, and I am very grateful that you took the time to listen in today. Now, this is not a femicide episode like it has been for this season of the podcast because, as I said last week, the femicide stories are very graphic and overwhelming. So this week we take a break from femicide to look at the story of the Kisumu Massacre of 1969. I'll just consider this a bonus episode. Now, this story was suggested by one of our listeners, and I really thank you guys for putting me onto some good stories. I learned so much while researching for this story, and it is also just an honor to be covering the stories that you want to hear. And now, without further ado, let us get into today's episode. And please stick around until the end of this episode to find out how you can support this podcast. Before we get into what happened, let us get into the background of how we ended up with the Kisumu Massacre. Now, before Kenya got independence, Jaramogi, Oginga, Odinga, and Mzee Jomo Kenyatta were close friends, united in the struggle to liberate Kenya. In fact, in 1961, Oginga Odinga successfully ran a campaign that led to the release of Kenyatta from detention, so that he would lead the Kenya African National Union Party, which is famously known as KANU. So when Kenya became independent in 1964, Kenyatta became the first president of the country because he had majority support from most ethnic communities in Kenya, and Oginga Odinga became his vice president. Jaramogi Oginga Odinga enjoyed support from the Luo community and the majority of communities from Western Kenya. I want you to remember that this is the time during the Cold War, which is a whole other episode and story in itself. Now, while Kenyatta and Jaramogi were in power, they had a lot of differences. Number one, Jaramogi was allied with Russia, which was the Soviet Union, and Kenyatta leaned more towards the other nations, the America and Britain, which were essentially differing with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Number two, Oginga Odinga did not agree with Kenyatta's land redistribution system that was used after colonization. Now, according to Oginga Odinga and his allies, there was a lot of corruption in the land distribution process, and it did not favor those who were poor and landless. Number three, the two could not agree on a power-sharing deal. Now, I could not get the details of this deal, but it has been cited as the cause of animosity between them in several interviews. When it seemed like they could not agree on anything, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga started getting sidelined by government. So in 1966, he resigned from his position as the vice president. Remember, he had his own supporters in government and even outside the government, Kina Bildad Kagia, who did not agree with some of Kenyatta's government policies. So he formed his own party called the Kenya People's Union, or KPU. And in the process, some of his allies from KANU moved with him. Now, in response, the Kenyatta government passed a law in July 1966 that allowed the government to arrest and detain people without trial. And guess who this law was immediately used against? The members of KPU. They were being arrested and detained here and there without due process because it was legal. Not surprising, because even today we have seen our parliament just coming up with ridiculous bills so that they can agenda an agenda. Now, at this time, obviously, there was a lot of animosity between Jomo Kenyatta and Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, and subsequently, it went down to KANU versus KPU, the Kikuyus versus Luos. Most Luos in government, who obviously supported Oginga Odinga at the time, lost their jobs. So there were political tensions, and these are some of the things that set the stage for the Kisumu Massacre in 1969. Now, let me take you to 1969, January 29th. Agwing Skodek, who was a Mau Mau lawyer and a close ally of Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, died in a car accident under very mysterious circumstances. 6 months later, on July 5th of 1969, Tom Mboya, who was a Luo leader and a nationalist, was assassinated. He was reported to be leaving a chemist along Moi Avenue when he was shot in downtown Nairobi. And this murder just really aggravated the Luo community further. Like, if they were at their tipping point, then just this sent them off the edge. His memorial service was chaotic because Tom Mboya was, at the time, probably the best leader that Kenya had ever produced. His story is long. Send me a comment if you would like to hear all of it. But the reason I'm saying this is so that you can see how tense things were at the time. There was a lot of mistrust between the government and the Luo community. So Tom Mboya is buried and people continue with their lives, although there are people who have some grievances. But again, what are they going to do? Now, around 3+ months after Tom Mboya's murder, Mzee Jomo Kenyatta was to tour the Western Kenya in a 2-day visit that was to begin in Nakuru and end in Kisumu before returning to Nairobi. While in Kisumu, Jomo Kenyatta was scheduled to officially open the newly built New Nyanza Provincial General Hospital, which is today referred to as the Jaramogi Oginga Odinga Teaching and Referral Hospital, or simply Russia. By the way, if you go to Kisumu, they call the hospital Russia because the hospital was built for £1.2 million provided by the United Soviet Socialist Republic Aid, which is currently known as Russia. So Jomo Kenyatta arrived in Kisumu from Kakamega on the afternoon of Saturday, 25th of October, 1969 to launch the hospital. He was accompanied by top government officials, ministers, and even Daniel Arap Moi, who was the vice president at the time. Now, in his book, which is titled My Journey with Jaramogi, Memoirs of a Close Confidant, Collins Odinga Odera, who was Jaramogi's close ally and his speechwriter, writes about the events leading up to the Kisumu Massacre. Remember, at this time, there is still animosity between Kenyatta and Jaramogi, and the people of Kisumu are also aggrieved by Tom Mboya's death. At this time, the political tensions are like a ticking time bomb. Odera writes in his book that he tried to convince Oginga Odinga not to attend the ceremony because they had been warned earlier that there would be problems if he attended the event. Odera said that despite his efforts to try and keep him from going, Odinga, who was the MP for Bondo at the time, insisted on attending. One of the main reasons why he did not want to miss the opening of the hospital was the fact that it had been built by Russians, who were his close friends during the Cold War, so he felt some type of attachment to the hospital. Odera said that from his assessment, Oginga Odinga was just a stubborn politician who wanted to use the event to make a political statement. According to Odungi Randa, who was another one of Jaramogi's allies at the time, he said that he felt that Jaramogi wanted to just welcome Kenyatta to Kisumu. But the thing is, even in the 2 days that Jomo Kenyatta had toured Western Kenya, he had made some statements here and there that did not sit well with members of KPU and the allies and supporters of Jaramogi. So on this Saturday, the 25th, when his motorcade was driving from Kakamega to Kisumu, he was received by a very hostile crowd. The people were jeering and others were carrying placards with messages that accused him of killing Tom Mboya. Other people were outrightly chanting Tunataka Mboya, which translates to We want Mboya. Now, what infuriated Mzee Jomo Kenyatta the most were the people chanting Dume, Dume, Dume. Now, Dume was the KPU party slogan because the party symbol was a bull. Odera writes in his book that Jaramogi had earlier warned KPU supporters against shouting party slogans at the launch, but it clearly fell on deaf ears. I want you to also know that the event coincided with the Kisumu District Sports Day, which meant that there were a lot of students who were in attendance, and some of them had just come to entertain the president. If you've been to national events, you see how that goes. So Mzee Jomo Kenyatta arrives and he's ushered to the podium and the program for the day officially starts. When Jaramogi was given a chance to speak, he accused the Kenyatta government of failing to fulfill the promises made to Kenyans. He basically told Kenyatta that the Luo community was unhappy with his leadership. He said, quote, "People are crying because they are hungry. You have not given them what you promised at independence." There was a war of words between Jaramogi and Kenyatta after that, which did nothing but just infuriate the crowd of supporters even further. At some point, Kenyatta tells Jaramogi, quote, Jaramogi, if you were not my friend, I would have crushed you like unga. You are rich while the people of Nyanza are starving. Maybe it's just me, but even from the audio, you can hear the anger in Mzee Jomo Kenyatta's voice. Now, the two exchanged words as the crowd grew more hostile. Supporters of Kenyatta started clashing with KPU supporters there and then. At this point, the president gets up and tries to calm the crowd down, but they would not listen to him. This immediately turned into a riot, and everything escalated when someone in the crowd threw a stone at the podium, almost hitting Mzee Jomo Kenyatta. Now, some reports say that Mzee was hit with a rotten egg, which is something that has never actually been substantiated. But you can imagine the chaotic scenes at the hospital. More stones get thrown, then it becomes chairs being flung around. So now the presidential guard and the police forces at the scene start shooting into the crowds as Kenyatta and the rest of the government officials are whisked away to safety. And now it is a stampede. The school kids are being knocked down, and the people are even trampling on them as they scatter away for safety because the police at this point are just shooting into the crowds without caring who would be hit. According to one of the witnesses who was at the scene, injured people were lying all over the ground, and he said it looked like a scene from a horror movie because the police were shooting anyone on sight. Now, this specific witness said that he was at the scene because he wanted to see the hospital being launched. But things just went wrong when the riot started. He was able to get out alive, but when he got home, he was informed that his 9-year-old son had been shot while playing outside their house. The chaos went on for about 15 minutes, after which calm resumed and Kenyatta actually opened the hospital. After that, he just got into his car and his motorcade left Kisumu. Now, it is reported that the shooting followed the motorcade. Kenyatta's security guards fired at random on the way, killing several people along the highway, reaching areas on the outskirts of Kisumu like Awasi and Ahero. Government sources say that 11 people died from the incident, but every other source say that the number of deaths from the incident came close to 100. According to the media, the Kenyatta government attempted to cover up the extent of the massacre. Almost all of the photographic evidence from the day and the event were destroyed. And even when I was researching for this story, I can say that I have seen less than 3 photos that I can prove were taken on the 25th of October from the actual day and the actual event. The media was censored and foreign journalists were kicked out of the country. Those who remained were closely monitored by the government. By the way, this would be the last time that Mzee Jomo Kenyatta would set foot in Nyanza before his death in August of 1978. After leaving Kisumu that evening, Kenyatta called for an impromptu cabinet meeting in Nakuru that night. The meeting ended with the decision to impose a curfew in central Nyanza and the Siaya area, where hundreds of people were arrested. On the 27th of October, 2 days later, all KPU MPs and some of the most prominent supporters of the party were arrested and taken to Committee Maximum Security Prison. The New York Times reported that KPU leaders were taken from their beds and driven to unknown destinations. That rings a bell, right? The abductions that have been happening in Kenya recently. Now, the government accused KPU of intentionally causing ethnic divisions in the country, so the party was banned and Kenya became a one-party state, with KANU being the only party. Jaramogi Oginga Odinga was placed under house arrest, where he stayed until 1971, and the Nyanza region was sidelined from the government and even development. Researching about this story, I just realized how far we have come as a country and how far we still have to go. Once again, thank you, Ian, for suggesting this episode. I really learned a lot of history. We have come to the end of this episode. That is all I have for you on the story of the 1969 Kisumu Massacre. This story reminds me of the political situation in Kenya today and how the political class really has no regard for the lives of the people they claim to lead. Seeing the same things that are happening now happened decades ago is actually infuriating because we literally have the sons of the same people in leadership. I'm going to end this episode here before I get angrier and out of character. So yeah, you can support this podcast by sharing this episode with your friends so that we can get a larger community to listen to these cases. I'll tag the podcast contact information and social media pages on the show notes of this episode so that it is easier for you to reach out if you have any feedback on this episode or the podcast in general. You can also use the same information to suggest crime cases that you would want to hear on the podcast, and I will get to them. Now, with all that said and done, what am I saying? With all that said and done, do not forget to give the podcast a 5-star rating on Spotify and catch the next episode of Krime KE podcast on Thursday next week. But until then, stay safe and remember, it is crime with a K.